Welcome to Giving an Answer, the show dedicated to defending the historic Christian faith. I am your host, Harold Felder, and today the topic is Mithraism. And to talk with me about this, I have a special guest, Alan Diodato. Okay, I know I'm messing up. What is it?
Very close. Diodato.
Diodato. Okay. Let me give you a little background about Alan. Alan has a Bachelor's of Art in Classics, which is the ancient Roman and Greek civilization. He has a Master's of Art in Classical Archaeology. He's an instructor at Central Piedmont Community College, where he teaches ancient and medieval humanities, myth, and human culture. And he's also pursuing a Master's of Arts at Southern Evangelical Seminary. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So, what else did I leave out?
As far as my background goes?
Well, I know you're married, so you probably want to mention
married,
that.
yes.
See, I'm trying to help you guys. All right, go ahead.
One wife and no children.
Okay.
So far.
Okay, so let's get right into it then. What is Mithraism?
Mithraism is one of a number of ancient pagan cults that existed in the early Roman era. It particularly focuses on the Persian god known as Mithras. And it's generally accused of being a biggest competitor, one of the biggest competitors with early Christianity.
Now, for those of you who have never heard of Mithraism, you're in good company, because up until a couple of weeks ago, I thought I knew what it was, and then I talked to you, I realized I have no idea what this is. But the reason I wanted to do this show is because so many people charge Christianity with stealing from these ancient cults.
Yeah,
and that's why we wanted to talk about that. We wanted to talk about some of those charges and that type of stuff. So how did you get involved in this?
I've always been interested in the ancient studies, probably because my family background, my family's originally from Italy. I mean, several generations we've been in the U.S., but family came from Rome, grew up interested in the culture of the Mediterranean, especially ancient Roman civilization, got into it in high school just sort of on my own. And when I got into college, I started studying classics and decided that's what I wanted to major in. And archaeology in particular, probably from the influence of the Indiana Jones movies more than anything.
Indiana Jones,
oh, yeah.
they got you?
Yeah.
Which one?
The first one.
Okay.
The first one, Raiders.
Is that when you decided to be an archaeologist?
Probably started getting in my mind around that time.
Have you done any exciting digs?
I've been to the sites. In grad school, I did a little work with some of the lab stuff for one of the digs in Rome, mostly with pottery, illustration and analysis, but not a lot of field work.
Yeah. I've always wanted to go on an archaeological dig, but the problem is I don't like getting my hands dirty, so that's probably a problem, huh?
Yeah, that'd probably be a drawback from it.
Okay. All right. You mentioned that Mithraism is one of the mystery cults.
Yeah.
What are mystery cults?
It's a sort of diverse group of these unique cults that they tend towards personal religion as opposed to what was common in the ancient world, which was like a state or run religion, which tend to be very impersonal. And they seem to be a reaction towards that. It involves people that decide to dedicate themselves to a particular group, at least for an initiation process. They've got a lot of similar characteristics. Christianity is often grouped in there as well. They go back mostly among the Greeks, possibly to the early 6th century BC, at least we have information going back that far. And there's a number of ones that you may have heard of. I don't know if you're familiar with the Eleusinian mysteries, the Bacchic cult, the Orphics.
Can you talk a little bit about that? These are completely foreign words.
Those are traditional Greek mystery cults. You've got the standard traditional religion, which was very much a state religion, as I was just mentioning, where you have dedication out of patriotic duty. You offer to the state gods, you got your regular sacrifices and things like that. And non-participation, in which sort of can border on the idea of lack of patriotism, stuff like that, especially when you get into the Roman era. The idea of offering to the state cults, and you probably heard of like the idea of emperor worship. Yeah. One of the big problems with early Christians is the fact that they refused the emperor worship, which would have been a duty of a citizen and loyal subjects of Rome. But you have the same things even in earlier Greece as far as different cities go. Well, the mystery cults are developed basically out of a desire for maybe a personal connection to the god, possibly the benefit of some kind of salvation, whatever that means exactly, some benefit in life that they can get out of participating in it. It's not something that was required for everybody. The traditional religion, the state religion, is required of everybody. The mystery cults are optional type of a thing. And they're not exclusive. You can participate in as many mystery cults as you desire. For instance, the Bacchic cult, which I just mentioned, was dedicated to the god Dionysus. And he had a certain following that would participate in these rituals that were generally held in secret. And there's, of course, a lot of talk about what exactly goes on in the mystery cults. And a lot of speculation just gets way out of hand. You have the same thing in early Christianity. People accusing early Christians of, practicing all kinds of things from incest to cannibalism and whatnot. Same types of things were accused, of the Bacchic cult and stuff like that. So Mithraism is one of these. But Mithraism comes out of the East, of the Near East. The ones I just mentioned are particularly Greek, but when you get down into the Hellenistic period, which is the period after the conquest of Alexander the Great in the 4th century, as he conquers from Macedonia and Greece all the way over to the borders of India, modern India, there's sort of a merger of the cultures, the Greek culture and the Near Eastern culture, Babylonian and Persian and Egyptian, and a lot of those ideas start to be amalgamated. And what you end up with are the import of some of these Near Eastern gods into these mystery type religions, such as Isis worship or Kybele worship and Mithras.
I've heard Isis mentioned a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me a little bit about Isis.
Isis was probably the most important deity that came out of Egypt. Not necessarily early on, but by the time you get to the Roman era, Isis is the most important goddess. She is a goddess over all kinds of different aspects, from fertility, rebirth, a guardian of the throne of Egypt, and all kinds of things like that. It becomes very, very popular among the Greeks and Romans in the Christian era. You've probably heard of Osiris, which is her traditional husband.
That's her husband.
Yeah, in the older myths of Egypt, he was the lord of the dead, the judge of the dead, and the husband to Isis. Sort of gets replaced after a while by a god known as Serapis in the Hellenistic era, which is sort of a Greek, almost a Greek creation. And the cult sort of spreads out, like I said, with the Hellenistic tradition into Greece, Rome, and beyond.
So what's the relationship between Mithraism and Christianity?
Well, the big thing is the accusation of Christian borrowing from Mithraism.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, there's a number of similarities that are generally brought out, at least in popular analyses of Mithraism, or at least popular discussion of Mithraism. And a lot of people say, due to the similarities, Christianity probably borrowed a lot of the ideas from Mithraism. And you also have the fact that Christianity, as far as when it arrives in ancient history, early 1st century AD, is long after the god Mithra has already been worshipped commonly.
So basically what happens is, the problem is that people, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to do the show, is that people claim that Christianity stole from Mithraism,
Mm-hmm.
that a lot of the foundations of Christianity actually was borrowed from some of these mystery cults.
Yes.
So what are some of the things that Christians are accused of stealing from Mithraism?
There's a number. The story itself, life of Christ, the basis of the Gospels, a lot of people say that the story of Mithras, or the myth that's connected to the god, it was the basis for the story of Jesus. And I can talk a little bit about that later, but that's just one of the accusations. They also pick up on a lot of the rituals that are similar between Christianity and the mystery cult, especially in Mithraism, the idea of a baptism. As far as an initiation goes, the idea of a Eucharist or a Lord's Supper of some sort, of communion. You also have the idea of a Sabbath worship, meeting on the Sunday, as opposed to the Jewish Sabbath of a Saturday, which is something that people say the Mithraic cult practiced. And you also have the whole Christian tradition of Christmas falling on December 25th, which is something that was early on connected to Mithraism as well. So it's a number of things.
But is it true?
That's a big question. Are those blown out of proportion, the similarities that people discuss? And I think for a large part, they probably are, a little bit exaggerated. It's hard to find a lot of basis in our knowledge of Mithraism because we don't have a lot of literary sources. We have sources from early Christian writers, and we have some sources from outside pagan authors, but they're very few, very short references, and we have to fall back on archaeology for most of what we know. So I think the first thing to probably look at is, when exactly did the cult develop in respect to Christianity? And they are pretty closely related time-wise, but what exactly is the time frame would be what we need to discuss.
So how old is this cult, this Mithraism?
That's part of the mystery, which is sort of interesting for the archaeologists to go and figure out exactly how old is Mithraism. The worship of Mithras, or Mithra, which is actually the more appropriate pronunciation of the name as far as the Persian god goes, dates definitely a couple millennia before Christianity. Like I say, Christianity, 1st century AD. We know of Mithra worship going back at least 2000 BC, or around that part. Mithra was originally an Aryan god, that you find him coming into India in the Vedic tradition, probably around 1500 BC. You've got the worship of Mithra coming into Persia, in ancient Iran, probably not long after that. You also have the gods show up in Anatolia, Asia Minor, among the Hittites. Those are all different Indo-European groups. You hear of Mitra, not pronounced similar to Mithra in the Rig Veda, in the early scriptures that are eventually going to be important in Hinduism later on. You don't have a lot of mention of him, however, in the early Zoroastrian tradition. In ancient Persia,
Talk about a little bit about Zoroastrian for people who don't know.
Yeah, the ancient Persians worshipped originally the standard Vedic gods. It was a polytheistic religion, had a number of gods based on elements of nature. And you hear a lot about Mithra being associated in there, usually with the supreme deity, which would have been Ahura, or possibly a version of the Indian Varuna, sort of appealed to as a god of contracts, a covenant type of a god, and has some connection with the sun in both of those. Even in the Hittite references, the earliest actual literary reference that we have comes from the Hittites, where he's mentioned in a 14th century contract, or a peace treaty really, between the Hittites and their enemies. And he eventually is associated with the sun. He is usually depicted as a god with this great glory. You see him in a great palace, mounting a chariot. It's a very powerful image that comes through. But we don't have any real story or myth that comes from those traditions, his birth or anything like that. So when Zoroastrianism starts to develop, it was a reform by a prophet known as Zarathustra, probably at the late 7th century, early 6th century. A lot of scholars hold to that date, though some people like to put it a lot earlier. Sort of a movement towards monotheism, where most of those pagan gods...
Monotheism is
the worship of a single god. And I guess it's a question whether his original reforms were more of a henotheistic type of push, which is where you have a particular god that's brought up to the dominant position within the culture, like the main god of the nation or something like that.
Yeah, and that's what we see a lot in the Bible. A lot of people don't realize when they talk about the god of the Philistines or the god of the Jews, because a lot of people thought about gods as just being your national god.
Right.
There wasn't this idea of this one God who was all over all things. There was like, well, our God's bigger than your God. Well, our God's better than your God. So it was a battle of the gods. Mm-hmm. And what's the term for that again?
The battle of the gods?
Well, the notion that different nations have different gods.
Oh, goodness.
You just used the word. It began with H.
Oh, henotheism.
Yeah,
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, national gods. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's also interesting. I'm just looking at the history of even the origin of Zoroastrianism and the traditional Hindu path, because they both worship essentially the same gods early on. And you see how they move further towards the polytheism in Hinduism, certain gods being raised up and certain other gods, the supreme gods, usually pushed down to a lower level. In Zoroastrianism, you got the main god, which eventually evolves as Ahura Mazda, who is the wise lord, the great god, and really the only god to worship. And all the other pagan gods of the culture are sort of either removed, demonized, as you see with Ahriman, who becomes the antithesis of Ahura Mazda. Sort of a dualistic religion is the way it evolves, where you have a good god and an evil god. They're in constant conflict with one another. And then you've got characters like Mithra, who's somewhere stuck in the middle. He's associated with Ahura Mazda. Doesn't show up in the earliest Zoroastrian writings, which would date to the time of Zarathustra himself, called the Gathas. But you do see him show up in some of the hymns, the Yashts, which come probably in the mid-5th century. So we have hymns dedicated to Mithra, which show him as a powerful god, almost equal to Ahura Mazda, but at the same time, since it's essentially a monotheistic belief by that point, or going in that direction, he is put into a category eventually where he's one of what are called the Yazata, which are these divine beings sort of akin to Judeo-Christian angels, sort of like a third level deity. And that's what they tended to do with a lot of the old, pagan gods, is they take a different position as angelic type beings in Zoroastrianism.
So if they're like thousands, so you're basically saying that this whole Mithra cult is thousands of years, what, predates Christ by a lot?
By a lot. I'm saying that Mithra does.
Mithra does, okay.
Mithraism would be a different question.
Okay.
Okay. The worship of Mithra spread everywhere, probably everywhere the Persians had conquered. They had the largest empire before the time of Alexander the Great, everywhere from, Europe to India. And you see the worship of Mithra as far east probably as Asia Minor, Pontus, in the areas of Cappadocia and stuff like that. But you have to distinguish between Mithraism as the cult, the mystery cult, and Mithra worship. We know Mithra worship goes back several millennia, but does the mystery cult go back that far?
Okay.
Probably not. Okay. I guess I'll talk a little bit about where the cult comes from, at least some of the theories. The cult itself, being a mystery type religion, is a little bit different than your traditional religions, which I already mentioned. The traditional way of viewing it was as an outgrowth of Zoroastrianism. Probably from the 19th century, people that were scholars in Mithraism were trying to figure out exactly what the connection was between what I'll call now Roman Mithraism, because it's during the Roman era that the cult really becomes popular and develops, and the older Zoroastrianism. And the theory was that, in the East there was an emergence of this cult that developed, and it was brought to the East probably by Roman soldiers and a Hellenistic contact. The theory, however, has sort of been challenged in modern era, basically because of the fact that in Zoroastrianism we don't have a lot of good parallels for what you see in the Mithraic cult. The elements that you find in Mithraic cult are not found in Persian sources. There's nothing in Persian literature that reflects the same types of ideas, stories, and stuff that you have coming out of Mithraism. So probably back in the 70s, during the First and Second International Congress on Mithraic Studies that were held, one in Manchester, England, and one in Tehran, in Iran, these scholars started to toyed the idea that maybe Mithraism as a cult was a Roman invention, something that was developed among the Romans that happens to employ a foreign god like Mithra, changes the name to Mithras with an S on the end, mainly for exotic purposes, to get the attraction to people that may have been frustrated or bored with the traditional Roman cults and Greek cults and want to do something from the East. And we do see heavy, widespread embracing of those Near Eastern gods like Isis, which I mentioned, and stuff like that in Rome around the 1st century AD and the 2nd century and on.
When you were mentioning that some of the things that Christianity is accused of taking from Mithraism, and you talked about the story about the life of Jesus, baptism, all that type of stuff. Okay, because I've read the literature that says that Christianity stole these things from the ancient cults. And I'm sure you've read it. The problem is, I've never seen any evidence that actually backs that up. I mean, I hear people say it, but what evidence do they use to back up those claims?
Not much, not much. Most of the sources that I see making the accusations, I have a hard time finding their footnotes that go to the sources to try to show where they got the material from. The first thing, like we were talking about dating the cult, since we don't know exactly when the cult starts, there are some theories. Now, if you're going to accuse Christianity of borrowing, one of the necessary conditions is that the cult exists prior to Christianity. Okay? So first we've got to find out, did the cult exist prior to Christianity, if it was to borrow from Mithraism? Secondly, even if it does predate Christianity, which is still in question, it doesn't necessarily, I mean, just the chronology doesn't provide a sufficient condition for Christian borrowing. You still got to prove the similarities that you're mentioning, the story of Mithras. Are there significant and real parallels that exist? You also have to determine, is there a probability of, what's the probability of there being, contact between adherents of both the faiths, early Christians and Mithraic worshippers. And then you also sort of have to rule out the possibility of other better sources for early Christianity. such as Judaism, which I think is the most obvious candidate for, you know, where Christian ideas and images and language come from, right out of the Hebrew tradition. So first, if we want to talk about the dating of the cult itself, since we don't have literary references, or many, again, we're going to look at the archaeology. When it comes to looking at what has been found of the Mithraic cult, late 1st century is probably the earliest you're going to find any remains of Mithraic images. The primary thing that you want to find, or the best thing you can find, is what's called the Mithraeum, which is essentially their place of worship. It was an underground or man-made type of cave setting, which centered around a particular image of Mithra slaying a bull. And the adherents would gather, you know, for their initiation ceremonies and stuff there. Now, we don't find any of those in the 1st century that I am aware of. The earliest remains come from Hungary, dating probably to the reign of the Flavians, which is going to be in the mid-70s in Hungary. The earliest Mithraeum that seems to come from the region where Christianity grows up, Syria and Palestine, is going to date to the mid-2nd century at a place called Dura Europos in Syria, which is probably the most important Mithraic site in the East, about 165 AD. So you're still talking a good over a century after early Christianity has come on the scene. So it's far too late to be significant in proving an earlier date for Mithraism. The earliest Mithraeum that we have in Palestine, which would be the closest to, obviously, early Christianity, doesn't show up until about the 4th century. So we're talking several hundred years after Christianity. So, as a matter of fact, the whole idea of an Eastern origin has sort of been thrown out because we don't have much evidence at all from the East. There's no Mithraic artifacts from Persia, which is where Zoroastrianism develops, and very few from, you know, the areas of Asia and the region there.
So basically, what you're saying is, and this is what my understanding is also, instead of it being that Christianity borrowed from these mystery cults, that the cults actually borrowed from Christianity.
Very possible.
So, because all the evidence that, well, there's no evidence the other way around. There's no evidence that Christianity did borrow any of these ideas from other cults.
The accusations of the Christian borrowing from Mithraism, I know, you could almost rule them out, I would say. As far as the mystery cults borrowing from Christianity, I think you've got a much better case in certain instances. For instance, by the time you get to the 4th century, we do have inscriptions that refer to people, you know, being born again for eternity, coming out of connection to cults like Mithras. And most scholars now look at some of those and say this is a straight borrowing from Christianity, which had been legalized in the earlier part of the 4th century. Right. And some of the emperors, like Julian, was trying to make a big shift back towards paganism and purposefully captured Christian ideas and language in order to compete with Christianity. So there definitely is, especially in late antiquity, borrowing in that direction. Now, if you want to talk about the parallels of the story.
Yeah, let's talk about the parallels. Okay. Let's go through some of them.
Okay, let's talk about the story of Mithra itself. Here's what you're usually going to find. You pick up a normal book that says, you know, what Mithra was like, and they're going to give you the same major points that you find in the Gospel. Mithra was born of a virgin. He was born on December 25th. He was born in a cave. At his birth, he was attended by shepherds who visited. The arrival of the Magi, which would have been of Zoroastrian priesthood from the east, come to visit. As a man, he had a following of disciples. 12 disciples would have attended him. There's mention of him dying, rising from the dead, having a Last Supper communal meal with his followers, and then ascending into heaven. I'm not sure how many sources I've read that draw out that basic storyline. But when you look at the evidence, it's hard to find any of those parallels.
Do they even document it? I mean, do they have footnotes that actually go to any original sources?
A lot of those sources don't, from what I found. Sometimes they'll refer to some phrases that you may find in some of the church fathers, the early church fathers, Tertullian, people like that. But as far as being able to go right back, especially to a Mithraic source, there's not much chance of that. Again, we didn't talk much about the nature of these mystery cults, but there's a great deal of secrecy involved. There's not a lot of literature, if any literature, that really comes out of the cults themselves, so we don't have written stories from Mithras, We have a few fragmentary references in the Church Fathers, and like I said, other pagan writers. But what we have to rely on to put the story back together are the archaeological remains, images, the iconography, some of the pictures that sort of tell a story. And from what can be gathered, most of the scholars will say, okay, as far as the birth of Mithras goes, there's no indication of a virgin birth at all in the way we conceive of a virgin birth. He was born from a rock, and he was born as a full-grown adult, which doesn't sound anything like the Christian story. That's the standard one, or born from a cave, or however it works out. Whether he had a father is another question. Some people say, you got the image of Cronus, which is a Greek titan who shows up in some of the art. At least that's how they identify certain figures. And people speculate whether he was somehow the father of Mithras. But again, you don't have a virgin birth in any discernible instance. Then you've got the whole issue of, which is probably the big issue, the death and resurrection. And again, there's no idea of the death of Mithras in any of the stories, any of the images. He doesn't die, period. There is a death that's associated with the story, but it's this one central part of the story that deals with Mithras capturing a bull and sacrificing this bull. That's the only death there is. The bull doesn't come back to life. Mithras doesn't die. Mithras doesn't come back to life. So there's no resurrection. There's no virgin birth. So obviously when you're reading some of these parallels, they're heavily embellished. A lot of speculation, which is natural. When you don't have much evidence to go off of, you speculate.
And it's sort of frustrating too, because people were buying into this.
Mm-hmm.
People, I mean, I do a lot of stuff on the internet, and when you hear people, the allegations of Christianity, and you see these charges again and again, and you never see any evidence, and it can actually hurt Christians who may be weak in their faith, or people who are just seeking. They're just basically flat out lies. Yeah.
That's one of the challenges, especially with the courses I teach in mythology. Of course, teaching with a secular school, and we go through lots of stories that seem similar. And again, you've really got to wonder, how different people deal with the stories. I mean, they're interesting when you do find a parallel, but what exactly does that mean? I think a lot of people that are Christians that get into mythology, that's probably the biggest challenge. When I was in college, the first real course I had in mythology was in classical mythology. I think it was a freshman or sophomore in college. And that was one of the biggest challenges, is going through that class and listening to all these stories that have parallels to Old Testament, New Testament stories. And, how exactly do I process all that? What's the reason that there are these stories? And, there's all kinds of, theories and stuff that you can come up with. So
when you were learning this, was the information presented to you as something that Christianity borrowed from, or what?
The professor that I had was definitely not from a Christian perspective. It was pretty much presented as a challenge to Christianity. Christianity is just another myth, I'd say, is the overall impression that you would have gotten out of that course. And to tell you the truth, that's probably when I first started getting into reading apologetic material, was during that course. The first time I picked up a book by Josh McDowell, just to be able to focus and understand the context of what I was listening to.
And so obviously the instructor didn't show you any real evidence. I guess he just made assertions.
Yeah. I was mostly just looking at the stories, looking at the art, looking at stuff like that, doing a little bit of analysis, but didn't really go into the historical background.
Here's a story that I hear a lot, the story of Osiris. I know this is not, I guess it's not related to Mithraism, is it?
Not really.
All right. Are you familiar with the story and
yes.
and the alleged parallel?
Yes.
Well, I'll let you tell it then.
Okay. Well, Osiris, as far as the myth goes, was the original pharaoh of Egypt. The king was murdered by his brother Set, the god of evil, disorder. His body was dumped in the river, and his wife, Isis, who we already mentioned, goes in a frantic search to find her husband and bring him back from the dead. And she does this a number of times, because she revives him temporarily, and he is again murdered and dismembered. By Set a second time, she goes back, and eventually he is brought to life as the god of the underworld. And there are references that, of that story that go back pretty much to the Old Kingdom Egypt, around 2600 BC plus.
And supposedly, and this is what got me, is that I was reading some material that said that the resurrection story of Jesus was taken from the story of Osiris. And
Very
then,
different.
Yeah, and exactly. But if you don't know that, then you just assume that.
Yeah.
You'll say, "Oh man, you know, that can be devastating."
Most of the stories that have any kind of, you know, possible resurrection type of a theme are usually connected to some kind of fertility cult. They're usually dealing with some kind of cycle of nature, you know, winter, spring type of annual growth and death type of a scenario. Osiris is somewhat related to that because he's associated with the Nile River and the fertility of Egypt. But, you know, it's not a resurrection that you see within the context of Christianity. It's not a person who literally rises from the dead. You don't see that. And a lot of scholars will point to their mystery religions in general, which are usually the most accused of dealing with the death and resurrection theme. And the scholars will say there's really not a lot of evidence for that, a true resurrection. Okay, because there are other ideas as well. But I mean, even the story itself, we don't have any Egyptian records of that exact story until the Greek writer Plutarch writes that down. He's writing at the late 1st, early 2nd century AD. It doesn't mean that he invented it. He obviously took it from Egypt, but still, it's a late source.
Right, but the things that are masquerading as a direct parallel to Christianity is so different because Osiris was like, you said, the king of the underworld. My understanding, he was like some mummy, you know, like a mummy who came back. How is that the same as the glorious Lord Jesus who came back in a glorified body and who, you know, who was Lord of all? I mean, there's no similarity.
No.
And it frustrates me just to hear that people consider there to be a similarity when people just don't know. I mean, that's one of the things I want to try to do on this show is to try to expose some of these things that are parading as fact when they actually aren't.
Right.
The next question I have is, supposedly there are ritual similarities between Christianity and the Mithraism cult. Yeah. What about that?
There are some accusations of the baptism, for one, which we probably should start with that, I guess. The idea of, you know, immersion in water as a sign of rebirth for the next life or conversion, which Christianity obviously has, the ritual of baptism, right there in the New Testament. You don't have real clear evidence of what exactly went on in the Mithraism cult as far as baptism. There are references to water. There's references to purification. Mostly the church fathers point out similarities, as well as some of the opponents of early Christianity. So you're saying early apologists were, you know, dealing with these same issues back then. And the problem is really determining what the exact symbolism was for whatever use of water that they had in Mithraism. There's one reference to initiates going bound through like a river or a man-made stream of some sort, and then being brought up to the other end and freed from their bonds. But that's just one of a bunch of different things that were going on in what appears to be a fairly traumatic experience. And people that analyze initiation rituals, especially male initiation rituals within various groups, from, you know, very primitive animistic religions all the way to modern day, point out those same similarities, what you see in Mithraism, what you see in generally any initiation ritual. Nothing unique about it, nothing necessarily symbolic of a new birth. There's one of the big authorities on ancient mystery cults, Walter Burkert, even mentions in his work on mystery cults that there's really no clear parallel for Christian baptism in any of the cults. There is parallels for purification, ablution, which you find not just in the cults, but in all kinds of religion all over the world throughout all history. So, you know, Christian baptism most clearly comes from the 1st century Judaic practice of, you know, baptizing proselytes and the stuff that you'd see in the Qumran community, and of course the tradition of John the Baptist. So I don't think there's any clear parallel at all with Mithraism.
We were talking before the show, and you made a statement. It was just a brief statement, but you made a statement that somehow that Mithraism or Mason somehow has a connection with Mithraism.
Yeah, as far as the mystery cults go, most of the cults, you know, go through initiation, and you sort of have this special identity with this group that you've gone through it with, but there's no sense of community that develops. I mean, you sort of go on about your own life. It doesn't really change anything. You don't have any particular teaching or doctrine. Mithraism was sort of unique in that there is a community. Mithraism as practice was actually only open to males, which is one of the reasons that people that accuse it of being the biggest competition with Christianity are probably so far off base, because just the fact that it secluded, 50% of the population rules it out from being a real serious threat to Christianity as far as popularity in the ancient world goes. So you've got this community of males that would gather together. They'd have the secret ritual, and you go through a number of different ranks. Mithraism was broken down into 7 ranks of initiates as you work your way up to the top rank. And a lot of people compare it to the Masons, modern-day Masons. But even today, there's still other groups that still have that same type of idea. I don't know if you've heard of the Mankind Project. A little bit familiar with that, just from people I know that have actually been through it. They run a thing called the New Warrior Training Weekend or something like that, and it's a very similar type of thing. All the males get together. They go through what are really essentially pagan rituals. You get this sense of identity. It's supposed to be for developing, the man inside, all that kind of stuff. But just, same type of thing. The Masons, again, different grades of initiation. Not that I'm an expert on Masons, but
right.
It is a parallel.
I want to talk a little bit more about Mithra and Mithraism.
Okay.
Where did, according to Mithra, or Mithraism, where did the god Mithra come from?
According to the myth, the best we can tell is he came out of a rock. What that means, it's hard to tell.
Do they ever try to explain where the rock came from?
No. Now, there is an astrological interpretation that's becoming very popular, where the idea of the rock, and it's actually sometimes depicted like an egg, would represent the cosmos. And somehow he comes into the cosmos and comes out. And there's a whole complicated idea of, how the initiate is supposed to eventually move his way outside of the cosmos somehow. It's sort of bizarre. I don't get into the astronomy, or astrology rather, all that often, but it's really unclear exactly where he comes from. And
see, that's one of the problems with being an apologist. When we ask these kind of questions, if he came out of a rock, then who created the rock?
Who created the rock?
Yeah, exactly. So
yeah, they're not going to get back to any kind of Christian concept of a creator God, the same,
Now, is Mithra, is he a man? Is he like a giant? Is he like a spirit? What is he?
Depicted like a man. All the art shows him as a simple man. I mean, he's born, sometimes they have him depicted carrying a torch with a knife. In his struggle with the bull, he's probably about the same size a normal man would be compared to the bull. So
does he have superpowers, or I'm trying to understand what makes him a god.
He's strong enough to wrestle a bull.
Well, you give me a sick or dead bull, I can wrestle it. I'm just trying to figure out what makes this, what makes him a god.
What makes him a god would just be the fact that he's been worshipped since 2000 BC plus.
Well, the people who worship him, why did they worship him? I mean, what was it about Mithra that made them decide, well, he's worthy of being worshipped?
I'm not sure how to answer that question. What makes any of the pagan gods worthy to be worshipped?
Okay.
Probably nothing, really. The connection with him and the sun is a big thing people come up with, that he's some type of solar deity. He's part of, sun worship long before modern sunbathing came into practice. The idea of worshiping the sun as a deity. Now, he's not the sun, but he is connected to the sun in some fashion. But could be like a hero type cult. I mean, the whole idea of him wrestling the bull in the myth is very similar to characters like Gilgamesh and Heracles, and even the gods like Hermes.
Gilgamesh, that name sounds familiar.
Ancient Sumerian king, who is the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the earliest. It is the earliest epic poem dealing with the hero that we have. He was a Sumerian king from probably about 2800 BC. Number of adventures, not a god, but in the ancient world, they believed that you have several classes of beings. You've got humans, you've got gods, and in between you've got these heroes, which are half god, half man.
The reason why I'm asking you about Mithra is because I want people to be able to see the difference between that god and our god. I want the difference to be very clear, and that's why I was sort of pushing on that. And also I want to ask, under Mithraism, under the cult, is there any such thing as the idea of salvation?
That is a big question. Mithraism has some kind of concept of salvation. That's one of the big parallels. What kind of salvation is it that we're talking about, though? All of the mystery cults promise some type of change in their life, or the initiate's life. And most people think it's related to sort of a votive type religion. You do something for the God does something for you. But it's not necessarily a salvation in a Christian sense, where you have a promised afterlife, okay, with God, okay, where, you know, a personal connection in that sense. Salvation in a lot of these religions can be something very, very temporal, where, you know, you're saved from something. You know, what are you being saved from? Are you being saved from starvation? Are you being saved from some kind of sickness? You pray to these gods often for safe voyage on a sea travel. Whatever the reason. We're not necessarily talking about a spiritual salvation. So the concept is there, but it's not the same concept. Again, later, as Mithraism develops in the Christian era, you're going to get references to things that become more and more spiritual and even celestial. But no, they don't have that same kind of concept. As a matter of fact, most pagans, one of the things that they looked at Christians doing was having this obsession with death and the other life, which they didn't find in their own religions. I mean, you have it in certain places, but not to the extent that you find Christianity dealing with, you know, living with God and being saved from our sins and stuff like that. So it's a very different context.
What was the concept of the afterlife in Mithraism?
Again, we can't tell. The common pagan, you know, Greco-Roman pagan concept of the afterlife varied from author to author. You've got the idea of Hades. You've got a general place where people go. You've got a lot of people that were, you know, straight atheists out of the philosophical schools. You've got a number of ideas of some type of paradise, possibly for certain heroic type people. You see most of this in the mythology. But you don't necessarily have the idea of living with the gods. That would not be an option. The idea of going to a heaven. That's not found in the paganism.
Is there an idea of sin?
There is an idea of pollution for sure. That you do certain things against the gods that bring pollution, such as manslaughter, which literally you have to be purified from before you can worship. But it wasn't the same type of culture. You don't have necessarily the internalized idea of a conscious sin and transgression against a god. You've got the idea of transgressing against other people in society, especially among the Greeks. You've got the idea that it's only bad if you get caught doing it. You know, it's sort of an external society. So that you don't have that idea, I've committed a sin. You know, I've committed something, you know, people caught me doing it, and there's going to be a consequence of that. But they don't necessarily deal with the idea that you see in Judaism and Christianity.
So Mithra, as God, did he create everyone else?
No. No. There doesn't seem to be any indication of him as a creator, definitely in Mithraism. Possibly in early worship, since he was connected with a supreme God, but we still can't see necessarily any aspect of him as creator. There's some early indications of him as a judge, like I said, as a contract keeper. That like punishes those that transgress covenants and contracts, but a creator, no. And he's not eternal. He is not omnipotent. He's not omniscient. So he has a lot of differences from what we see in Christianity.
So in that cult, who created man?
Well, the gods ultimately do, but we don't really have a story where you can explain where the gods come from. It's very difficult to answer the question of where things start in a mythological context. Most creation myths start with something because they can't answer the, you know, where did things come from in the first place type of a question. So, but usually it's a god that fashions man. There's usually various deities depending on the culture that you're talking about. Sometimes it's a person that makes the god out of clay. Sometimes the tears of a god. In the case of Egypt, like Ra, when he weeps, his tears become men. I mean, you don't really have the idea of creation ex nihilo that you do in Judeo-Christian tradition.
Another charge against Christianity is regarding Christmas, that we stole that, and it's basically a pagan holiday. And could you touch on that?
Yeah, a little bit. The date of December 25th was definitely associated with a number of pagan traditions, basically because it's the time of the winter solstice. It was a solar event. You know, it's the shortest day of the year as far as the amount of light. And after that, of course, it's the idea that the light starts to become stronger and stronger after that point. So it was usually viewed as the birth point for the sun. The Romans had a tradition, around the winter solstice called the Saturnalia, which focused on the fertility god Saturn. That was usually practiced somewhere around December 17th to the 21st, somewhere in that range. Probably in the 3rd century, there was a Roman emperor named Elagabalus who brings over a Syrian solar deity, which was called Sol Invictus, and tried to raise him to the point of dominance among the Roman gods, almost a henotheistic movement, very unpopular. But by the end of the 3rd century, during the reign of Aurelian, the cult of Sol Invictus had become pretty popular. And his main worship was usually centered on December 25th as the birth of the sun. Mithras starts to get associated with Sol Invictus because of his connection with the sun in the iconography. Whether they ever actually celebrated the birth of Mithras on December 25th is a different question. It was definitely a solar event and a solar holiday. Christianity now comes along, 4th century and following, and eventually adopts the date. There's a lot of argument about when they're going to celebrate the incarnation, the birth of Christ, but they eventually, in the West for sure, settle on December 25th. And the question is it really them borrowing paganism, or is there something more to it? And if you really look at what they're trying to do, early Christians were very careful about selecting holidays like that holiday or that date to show the dominance of Christianity over the pagan worship. They got this pagan worship that's going on the 25th. Christians now decide that they're going to sort of subsume that date. That paganism is going to be eradicated by replacing it, not embracing it. They take the date because it's actually the faster way of getting rid of the pagan tradition is replace it. Because you figure when Rome becomes Christian, not everybody's going to embrace Christianity inside, real, true conversion. Right. But a lot of people outwardly are forced, especially by the end of the 4th century, that's the only official religion you're allowed to believe in, would easily have the home life continually practicing the older traditions, which you don't necessarily want to break with. If Christianity didn't set up their holidays in conjunction with some of those holidays would continue on for some time. By replacing them, you're giving people something else to worship in place of that, and the tendency is to continue your traditions with a new meaning. And now we're not worshiping the sun, we're worshiping the birth of the Savior. And that's how it sort of gets attached to certain dates. In Christian tradition, especially Roman Catholic tradition with their saints' feasts and stuff, a lot of times place them on the same dates where there would be a earlier pagan festival for the same reason, to get rid of it, to eliminate it. So that's really where you get that connection.
Okay, let me see if I can summarize what we talked about. Basically, Mithraism is an old cult. It's a cult that a lot of people have charged Christianity with stealing from. We've, according to them, borrowed a lot of our rituals and beliefs from them, such as the virgin birth, the resurrection, that we have just stolen these things from other cults, whereas in actuality there is no evidence that has actually happened. In fact, the evidence is more to the fact that they borrowed from us, because these things that we sort of borrowed didn't even become prevalent in their literature until 100, 200, maybe 400 years afterwards. So Christianity did not borrow from these other cults. These other cults more than likely borrowed from Christianity. Is that a good summary?
I like that summary.
All right. Well, on that note, Alan DiDonato, that will end this episode of Giving an Answer. Be sure to join me again next time. And until then, goodbye and God bless. You can find out more about Giving an Answer, as well as listening to other broadcasts, by visiting us online at www.givingananswer.org.